So anyway, I hope everyone had as they say, a meaningful fast. And Be'ezras Hashem, well, you'll see, I'll actually talk about, I'm going to give you a post-fast talk about the fast. And what's interesting is that if you look at the Shulchan Aruch, there's actually supposed to be a 3-day fast. You eat in the middle of the nights in between. There is the 8th of Tevet, the 9th of Tevet, and the 10th of Tevet. Now, of those 3 days, only the righteous fast for 3 days. Most of us only fast 1 day, the 10th of Tevet. So the 10th of Tevet is the only one that's obligatory. And this was the date that Nebuchadnezzar began the siege against Jerusalem at the time of the destruction of the first temple, which 3 years later culminated in the destruction of the temple on the 9th of Av. Now, the events that happened on the 8th and the 9th have absolutely nothing to do with that particular event. On the 8th of Tevet, the Gemara records that the 70 elders completed a translation of the Torah into Greek. And this is the story that is recorded. This is the story of the Septuagint, or the Targum HaShivim, and that is one of the kings that succeeded Alexandria was Ptolemy. He established the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. And one of Ptolemy's objectives was to create like a national library or a library of Congress in which every book in the world was in his library. It was actually one of the wonders of the ancient world. And as a result, he commissioned a translation of the Torah into Greek. And 70 elders, or 72 elders, according to one version, were placed in separate rooms. And through divine inspiration, they came up with an identical translation. And somebody once asked Rav Hutner, are we supposed to believe in that miracle, that 72 people in separate rooms came up with the same translation? So Rav Hutner's response was, if they would have been in the same room, it would have been a bigger miracle. So the miracle is not so great if they're in separate rooms. And this is called the Septuagint. And the Talmud indicates that the day that the Septuagint was completed, darkness came into the world. But the Talmud does not tell us what was the problem with it. Now, most people say, well, by translating the Torah, you make it available to non-Jews, and non-Jews can introduce distortions, perversions. They could now interpret the Torah in different ways, and therefore it would have been better not to have that translation. But that's a difficult position, really, to take, because in point of fact, Moshe Rabbeinu himself was commanded to translate the Torah into different languages, and there actually is a point that we want the wisdom of the Torah to be available to the world so they can learn from. To simply condemn something because it made the Torah accessible to non-Jews would seem not to be a valid point, because that's part of the Ratzon Hashem. Now, a second possibility might be that the Gemara tells us that the translators introduced certain distortions uniformly into the translation. For example, they inverted the word order. The beginning of the Torah is Bereshis bara Elokim, in the beginning God created. But in Hebrew that could be translated the beginning created God, which means God was created at the beginning of time. So to avoid that misunderstanding, they inverted the word order to clearly indicate God created the beginning. Another example is said that in the list of non-kosher animals, it lists the rabbit as a non-kosher animal, arnevet. And apparently, whatever the Greek name for rabbit is, Mrs. Ptolemy had that name. So if they would simply say in a Greek verse, Mrs. Ptolemy is a repulsive non-kosher animal, that wouldn't have looked good, so they used a euphemism for rabbit. But I want to mention a third example of interesting distortion, which is not even mentioned in the Gemara, but it's very, very fascinating. And that is the Septuagint, which is the Targum HaShivim, reinterprets a certain verse in Sefer Shemos to take a halachic position that is much stricter than the rabbinic position in the Gemara itself. We know that abortion is generally a sin, but the Jewish position on abortion is not the same as the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church treats abortion as equivalent to murder, And the Catholic Church says that life begins upon conception, and there is no distinction between terminating a newly fertilized egg and killing a 25-year-old man. Now, halacha doesn't quite say that. Halacha actually says that something does not have the status of an autonomous human life until it's born. Abortion is not a capital offense. Abortion is a sin because you are preventing a potential from being actualized, but not because it is an actualization in and of itself. And the proof for that position is in Exodus, in Parshas Mishpatim, the Torah discusses two men that are fighting, and if a pregnant woman steps between them to stop the fight, and she gets hit in the belly, and as a result there's a miscarriage, so the Torah says the following: if there is a calamity, the word is oson, then they do not have a financial penalty. If there's no calamity, then they must pay for the financial loss. Now, what does that mean? So the Talmud explains, calamity refers to the woman herself being killed. And there actually is a rule in halacha that if you commit a crime for which there is a death penalty, that absolves you of financial liability for something peripheral to that. So if I kill somebody, I don't have to pay the cleaning bill for getting his suit sullied with blood and the like. So therefore the Talmud makes the point that if the mother is killed, so that is an act of murder, albeit unintentional, there will be no financial liability for the loss of fetal life based on the principle that capital offenses cancel out financial liability. If, on the other hand, the mother is not killed, so all you have is the destruction of fetal life, for that there's compensation. And this is the basis of the Talmudic ruling that abortion is not a capital crime. Because if abortion were to be a capital crime, there would be no financial penalty, because that would also be a capital crime. Now, the Septuagint has a radically different translation of the word oson, and they connect the Hebrew oson, in a very questionable linguistic jump. They connect the Hebrew word oson with the Greek word soma, which means body. And they translate the verse this way: if there is an oson, if the fetus already has arms and legs and a formed body, then the abortion is a capital offense, and there's no compensation. And if the fetus does not have a formed body, then it becomes a monetary offense. Which means that the Septuagint actually translates the Chumash to take a much more stricter position on abortion than halacha actually does. Now, what's fascinating is that although the Septuagint was completed by rabbis, it did not become part of the Masorah of the Torah Shebaal Peh. It was not consulted by Jewish scholars and did not become part of the halachic tradition. Fascinatingly, however, the Septuagint had an enormous influence on Christianity. Many of the church fathers who knew Hebrew, most of them knew Hebrew, but their primary language was Greek, and they learned the teachings of the so-called Old Testament were primarily mediated through the Septuagint. The Septuagint was much more influential in Christianity than it was in Judaism, and some historians have posited that the position of the Catholic Church equating abortion with murder was ultimately derived from the Septuagint. Now granted, the Catholic Church took it further, because the Septuagint only made it murder when arms and legs are formed, and not at that earlier point. The Catholic Church went further, but some have suggested that the Jewish Septuagint actually influenced. Now, if indeed that is a distortion of Jewish law, one could understand, going back to the basic point, why the Chachamim looked at it in a very negative way. So again, the standard explanation, we don't like to translate the Torah for Goyim. That seems to be a flawed explanation, because God wants the Torah to be known. The second explanation is the distortions were a matter of concern. That would be a potential problem. But there's a third explanation that maybe is the most compelling, and that is the problem with the translation was not that it made the Torah available for the non-Jewish population. That could be positive. But rather, this was a sad reflection that so many Jews were so illiterate in Lashon HaKodesh that they needed the translation. The Jewish community of Alexandria was huge, was wealthy, was politically well-connected, and was very, very assimilated and Jewishly illiterate, much like, let's say, the Jewish community of the United States of America. And as a result, for them, the Septuagint was a huge, huge tool. In fact, Philo of Alexandria, who was a very renowned Greek Jewish philosopher, who was somewhat traditional. Again, would he be an Orthodox Jew, as we call it today? We're not really sure, but he certainly was a lover of tradition. He writes that in Alexandria, every year, the community would celebrate the anniversary of the completion of the Septuagint. So what Rabbinic Judaism regarded as a tragedy, they considered that to be a simcha. You know, the Gemara discusses, are you allowed to write a Torah scroll in Greek? Now, when you learn a Gemara like that, you wonder, who would ever think of writing a Torah scroll in Greek? But this was a very practical question. In a huge community like Alexandria, you might not be able to find a Baal Koreh who could read it in Hebrew. They talked about that. Remember, there's a huge description in the Gemara of the beautiful, magnificent synagogue of Alexandria. It was so huge, there were gold chairs and silver chairs, and it was so big that nobody could hear the chazan. They didn't have microphones in those days, or on Shabbos or whatever. So there was a gabbai with a flag. When the chazan finished the bracha, the gabbai would wave the flag, and people would answer Amen. What sometimes escapes people's notice is there's a certain sarcastic parody nature in that description. A lot of the description is pretty obviously hyperbolic. It's describing something much huger than it was, and it really reflects kind of the rabbinic disrespect for communities that were based on money and influence and ostentatiousness, which were fundamentally Jewishly illiterate. So, in a sense, therefore, the discomfort Chazal had with the Septuagint was the fact that it may have been absolutely necessary, but it was sad that it became necessary. Just like crutches. If a person's legs are not functioning, it's a great bracha to have crutches. But it's a very sad thing that you need the crutches and you can't walk on your own. You know, we have, Baruch Hashem, we now live in a world where so much of the Torah is available in translation, Art Scroll and the like. And that is a wonderful thing. It makes the Torah available for people. And that's a great, great thing. But there's a certain undercurrent of sadness that we need those translations because people cannot go back to the original sources, at least initially. And of course, keep in mind, by definition, a translation can only capture one nuance at a time. You know, in an original text, especially a divine text, there are going to be infinite nuances. Every translation is just a snapshot of one particular meaning, and so much is going to be lost. So that was the tragedy of the 8th of Tevet. But again, it's a bit of an ambivalent tragedy, because on one hand, translating the Torah was a good thing. On the other hand, the fact that an assimilated community relied on that translation is something for which we mourn a little bit. Let me mention that Philo of Alexandria...
Don't we also learn that even here in Eretz Israel, when the Torah was read in public gathering during the same period of time, someone had to publicly translate it?
That's correct. It was translated in Aramaic.
So what's the difference?
Well, that is an interesting point. Aramaic, though, although Aramaic is not an indigenous Jewish language, Aramaic was something like Yiddish in the sense that because this was the language of the sages, so it acquired a certain quasi-sanctity, which elevated it above things like Greek and the like. You know, so again, Yiddish would be a very good analogy that, you know, we regard Yiddish as somewhat of a holy language simply because of its usage by the sages over so many hundreds, if not millennium.
But wasn't Aramaic originally from Kurdish, spoken by
Aramaic may have been the original language of Avram Avinu. It is spoken to this very day. It is spoken by the Kurds and by a number of Christian communities in Syria. So there are no Jewish communities, except some Jews from Kurdistan, but there are no Jewish communities that speak Aramaic as a language, but there are Christian communities that do. So if you have a hard word in Gemara, contact your Christian friend in Syria, and they may be able to help you out in terms of Aramaic and the like. Also, Aramaic is much closer to Hebrew than Greek, ancient Greek is. Okay. Yeah.
Yes. Is it was problem that it was a forced translation, and that it could be maybe used against Jews potentially, like?
Yeah, the question is though, many say that it was the first translation. I mean, the problem basically is, what happened to the translations of Moshe Rabbeinu? That's a bit of a problem. Did they just disappear? Moshe Rabbeinu translated the Torah into 70 languages. Now, maybe that wasn't the whole Torah. Maybe that was only the mitzvos of the Torah, because it's hard to imagine how Moshe could do 70 whole translations. That would have been a miracle, certainly. But it's hard to know, because they seem to have disappeared from history. And then we look at the Septuagint as the new translation. Okay.
They were plastered over, or it was written on the plaster?
Well, those are two opinions. Some say they were plastered over, but then another opinion says, what sense does that make if people aren't going to see it? So it has to be on top. Just like Lahavdil in Rome, I believe you have the 12 tablets, meaning Rome had a thing that when you entered the city of Rome, the main laws were all put on columns, so every person entering would be aware of what the laws were. And Moshe Rabbeinu's translations of the Torah were supposed to be the same thing. You come to Israel, Eretz Israel, these are the laws of the land. But as learned a Jew as Philo of Alexandria, historians still debate. Some historians take the position that Philo did not know Hebrew, and Philo's whole knowledge of the Torah was via the Greek translation. It's not clear. Again, we don't have a particular proof one way or the other, but this is a position that a number of historians have taken. Okay. We now come to the 9th of Tevet, which has a fast for a totally different reason. So I open up the Shulchan Aruch. Why do some tzaddikim fast on the 9th of Tevet? The Shulchan Aruch says they didn't want to give you the reason. Very, very strange. There is a fast, but we're not telling you why. Well, one thing that happens for sure, when somebody tells you they're not giving you the reason, people certainly want to look for the reason, right? That incites your curiosity. So the standard reason that's given really makes no sense, because why would this be concealed? It is said that the 9th of Tevet was the yahrzeit, was the anniversary of the death of Ezra HaSofer. Now Ezra, right, was the great prophet and Kohen, who was the religious leader of the Jewish people at the beginning of the Second Temple after the 70 years of the Babylonian exile. And it was Ezra that reconstituted the religious community and the observance of the Torah. He organized the men of the Great Assembly, the Anshe Knesset Agdola, and Chazal consider Ezra to be so great, and his leadership was so essential, that he is compared to Moshe Rabbeinu. And it is said that had the Torah not been given to Moshe, Ezra would have been worthy to receive the Torah from God. And as a result, on the day of his death, we mourn and we grieve to this very day. Now, that's in the Slichos. The Slichos this morning mentions that the 9th of Tevet was the yahrzeit of Ezra HaSofer. But the problem is very obvious. That's not a reason you got to keep secret. I mean, the Shulchan Aruch says, we fast and we're not telling you why. If it's the yahrzeit of Ezra HaSofer, so that's the reason. It's not a secret. So let me, it's interesting we were talking about the debate with Christian missionary. There are two Christian reasons why the 9th of Tevet became a fast that we didn't want to publicize. But in our small group, I will publicize it. One speculation is that the 9th of Tevet was the actual birthday of Jesus of Nazareth in the year that he was born. Now, as you know, the December 25th as the date of Jesus' birth is bichlal not an accurate date. But Jesus was born towards the end of the solar year, November, December, and of course the Russian Orthodox Church has a different date for Christmas. So according to this tradition, the 9th of Tevet was Yashka's birthday. And since the birth of Yashka heralded so many devastating sorrows that the Jewish people have suffered for centuries and centuries. So we make a fast, or some righteous people would make a fast on the day of Yashka's birth, and the Hebrew date was said to be the 9th of Tevet, and they've actually seen some astronomical calculations that try to prove that based on the actual year of his birth and the like. And you can well understand why we would not want to publicize that reason, because if the Christians see that we're fasting because we're grieving the death of Yashka, that looks very bad. Because that's not like Good Friday where you're fasting because of crucifixion. This is fasting because of his birth, and that would look very bad. But there's a second Christological reference that is even more intriguing and fascinating, and it may be a Baba Maisa, may be totally untrue, or it may be true. We don't have definitive evidence. But this is, it's not from Chazal, it's not in the Medrash, but it comes from sources in Rishonim, like the Machzor Vitri, which was written by disciples of Rashi, and in a famous book of anonymous authorship called Toldos Yeshu. Toldos Yeshu is kind of the Jewish history of Yashka. And this was a widely circulated work in the Middle Ages, anonymous authorship, and it actually had multiple versions as well. But here is the story. The story is that the 9th of Tevet is a yortzeit. It is the day of the death of a righteous person. But the righteous person we are commemorating is not Ezra HaSofer, but it's a man called Shimon Kippah. Shimon Kippah. Kippah in Aramaic is rock. Shimon Kippah is none other than the man that is known in the Christian Bible as Simon Peter, the Apostle Peter, Yashka's closest disciple, and the one who succeeded him as the leader of the church. Peter became the first pope, the first bishop of Rome, and his name was Simon, Shimon, and Peter means rock, Petra. And Yashka gave him the name Peter because he says, upon this rock I will found my church. And in Aramaic, that's Kippah. Kippah means rock, and Shimon Kippah is the Apostle Peter. So the 9th of Tevet, we fast because we're grieving over the death, not the birth, the death of a great tzaddik, the Apostle Peter. What on earth does that mean? The Apostle Peter is a tzaddik in the Jewish tradition? So listen to the story that is recorded in Toldos Yeshu.
Excuse me, what's the name of the book again? Tovas?
Toldot, the history. Yeshu.
Oh.
Yeshu is, Jesus, abbreviated. Toldos Yeshu. You can look it up. There's a Wikipedia article on it. You can look it up. This is a very well-known book, but it's like there are 10 different versions of it. Each one version is a little different. Toldos Yeshu gives us the following story about Shimon Kippah. The early Christians were, of course, all Jews, as Yashka himself was a Jew, and as a result, similar to Messianic Jews today. They infiltrated Jewish congregations. They davened in synagogues. They participated in Shabbat and in Yom Tov. And this was a very dangerous thing. This was like a cancer within Judaism, because as a result, your Jewish friends and neighbors might be espousing Christian heretical ideas. And the Chachamim, the hated Pharisees of the New Testament, so to speak, the Pharisees thought this was a very, very dangerous thing, because this was introducing a cancerous influence that could take Jews away from Judaism. So Shimon Kippah volunteered to do the equivalent of a suicide mission, a spiritual suicide mission. He basically said, I will create a church. I will create a new religion. I will, as it were, take Christians out of Judaism and make them a sect and make them a group that is totally distinct. And in that way, they will be seen to be a different religion. In other words, they will no longer be part of Judaism, so to speak. They will be separate. And although once they're separate, they could oppress us, they could hurt us in various ways, but at least black and white will be clearly demarcated. We will know Christian, Jewish. So Peter said, in order for me to do this, I have to give up my affiliation with the Jewish community. I have to go to Yashka and say I embrace him wholeheartedly, and I know I will never be part of the Jewish community again. I will live my life as one who repudiated Judaism, but I will continue to keep the commandments privately. So the first pope was in fact a religious Jew, not only a Jew, but a religious Jew, according to this legend or this story. And Shimon Kippur just asked one thing. He says, I am leaving the Jewish people forever in order that other Jews should not be dragged into apostasy. But he asked the sages, please remember me. Remember the anniversary of my death. And in Toldos Yeshu it is recorded that the fast of the 9th of Tevet is in memory of Peter, who in our tradition actually is a saint, Saint Peter, so to speak, because he sacrificed his own Judaism in order that Klal Yisrael should not be hurt by Christian influence. Now, to add something even more wild to this, he also composed a prayer, and he asked the sages to include this prayer in the liturgy, and this prayer is none other than the prayer Nishmas. Nishmat is a very beautiful prayer that we recite every Shabbos morning, and we recite at the Pesach Seder, and according to at least one Masorah, the author of Nishmas is none other than Shimon Kippur. And in memory of his great sacrifice for the Jewish people, we recite his beautiful prayer as well. Now, this is quite a wild story, and there are some Rishonim who say this is heretical, and they actually say anyone that says that Nishmas was written by the Apostle Peter is going to have to give an accounting to God after 120 years. So some authorities were absolutely aghast at that type of reconstruction, but some opinions say it did happen. Now, I'll mention another thing. There was a similar theory in the 19th century among historians that was the role of Paul, the Apostle Paul. Now, Paul, again, I'm not going to go over Christian history in too much length. Paul was not one of Yashka's apostles. I shouldn't have called him. He was not the Apostle Paul. In fact, he didn't know Yashka. I mean, Jesus was crucified before Paul went on the scene. But Paul declares himself that he was a student of Rabbi Gamliel. And Paul says he was a proud Pharisee, and Paul says he was going to persecute those Christians. And that was his road to Damascus, to kind of find some Christians and beat them up, whatever Paul was going to do to them. And then, of course, he had his famous epiphany, the road to Damascus, right? A very famous expression that's entered the language. So in the 19th century, there was a theory among academic historians, and they probably got it from Toldos Yeshu, that it was Paul that really broke Christianity off from Judaism. And that actually makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense. In fact, it makes much more sense to locate it in Paul rather than Peter, because Paul created ministry to the Gentiles. And it was Paul that actually taught the Torah doesn't have to be kept anymore, because all you need is faith. So it could very well be that in rabbinic literature generally, the apostles are all mixed up, meaning to say, they say Peter or they mean Paul, and the Chachamim were not always medayek in whom they were talking about. So it could very well be that the Toldos Yeshu reference to Shimon Kippur should be understood as a reference to Paul, and then that would validate the academic theory of the 19th century that Paul was a secret agent designed l'shem shamayim and l'shem yahadus to break Christianity away from Judaism, to make it a separate religion so it would no longer infiltrate within. And of course, the infiltration is a major danger that we face, because now you do have that infiltration. You have the Messianic Jews, people who have stitches out, and they may even look Haredi on some level. And, they infiltrate, and that can be a very dangerous thing. It's good that, armies should have their own uniforms, and you know who's on each side. Okay, so that's the 9th. So we did the 8th of Teves, we did the 9th of Teves, And then, of course, we come to the one fast that is obligatory, and that is the 10th of Tevet. And this is the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar's siege against Jerusalem when the first temple was destroyed in the year 586 before the Common Era. That's the common date that is given. Now, there's an interesting conceptual problem with the 10th of Tevet that I want to bring up. We have a total of 4 fast days in the year that are connected to events concerning the destruction of the Beis Batei Mikdash. Tisha B'Av, of course, is both the day of the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash and the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash, 490 years apart to the day, Tisha B'Av, Tisha B'Av. The 17th of Tammuz is primarily connected to the second Beis HaMikdash because that was the day the Romans broke through the walls of Jerusalem. Tzom Gedalia, however, and Asara B'Teves are only connected to the first temple. Asara B'Teves was the day when Nebuchadnezzar began a siege against Jerusalem. That was not the day of the Romans beginning the siege. In fact, we don't commemorate the day that the Romans began the siege. So today, Asara B'Teves is only Mikdash Rishon. It is not Mikdash Sheni. And similarly, Tzom Gedalia, which is after the Churban, Tzom Gedalia is the latest event. That was the assassination of the Jewish governor Gedalia, who was the governor of the remnant of the Jewish community that remained in Eretz Yisrael after the Churban. And he was assassinated by a fellow Jew, and that was treated as the final nail in the coffin, the final destruction of the Jewish presence in Eretz Yisrael. But it's the first Mikdash, not the second Mikdash. Now, why is that important? Like, why is it important whether you're commemorating a first Mikdash tragedy or a second Mikdash tragedy? So the problem is the following. All of us know the famous passage in the Gemara, Maseches Yuma, that the first temple was destroyed because the Jews were guilty of the most serious averos. Avodah Zarah, idolatry. Gilui Arayos, sexual immorality. Shvichas Damim, murder. Now granted, as Rabbi Avigdor Miller points out, we're never making the claim that most of the Jewish people did all of these averos, but it was prevalent enough that this was a stigma and a blemish on Klal Yisrael. And these 3 averos are so chamor that you have to be willing to die before you transgress for them. And God destroyed the temple and exile. Now, the second Beis HaMikdash, Chazal say, most of the Jews were observant. Most of the Jews were doing mitzvahs. Most of the Jews were learning Torah. So why was the second Beis HaMikdash destroyed? So the famous passage is, it was destroyed because of sinat chinam, polarization, hatred, dissension for no reason, machlokas. And then the Gemara goes on and says, look how deadly and pernicious sinat chinam was. The first Beis HaMikdash, which had the worst conceivable sins, Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayos, Shvichas Damim, the Galut was only 70 years. And then Cyrus allowed us to come back. But the second Beis HaMikdash, which was destroyed because of Sinat Chinam, we are still suffering that galus after almost 2,000 years. Right? So Sinat Chinam is a big, big thing. Josephus, who's an extremely interesting person, you can love him or hate him. Josephus, Yosef ben Matisyahu, right? There's a street in Yerushalayim, Yosef ben Matisyahu, named after Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish general. He was a Kohen. And he surrendered his army and he surrendered himself to the Romans, like a Benedict Arnold, feeling that there was no possibility of victory. And as a result, he lived the remaining years of the Jewish revolt in Rome under the protection of the emperor. But he tried to salvage his reputation by writing histories of the Jewish people, in which he tries to paint the Jewish people in a favorable way. But at the same time, he could not condemn Rome that much because he's writing it in the shadow of the Roman emperor. So he recounts a story that the infighting among Jewish sects for control of Yerushalayim, Jew to Jew, was so strong and so vicious that in the Beis HaMikdash itself there were warring sects. There was one group that was shooting arrows from one side and another group that was shooting arrows from the other side. And the Kohanim were ducking the arrows to bring the korbanos that they had to bring. This is Josephus' own description. And he actually quotes Titus as saying that maybe I don't have to destroy this city after all. If I just bide my time, the Jews will do it to themselves. Now, did Titus say it? Obviously, anything Josephus reports has to be taken with an enormous grain of salt. On the other hand, it rings true because it does fit what Chazal talked about when they talked about the awful sinat chinam that existed within the Jewish people. Now, let's go back to this. When we mourn the destruction of the temple, what we think about is not just to cry over spilled milk, but we try to rectify in our own personalities the sins which caused the Chorban Beit HaMikdash. And we try to resolve in our own lives that we try to rebuild the Mikdash by removing the reasons for its destruction. And even if we're just a single person, like Helen Keller used to say, I am only one person, but I am one person, meaning to say I can work on myself. And if everybody had that agenda, the world would be transformed. So, here's the problem I want to raise with you. When it comes to Second Temple, which focuses on Sinat Chinam, I can certainly identify those averos in my own personality. No, I don't have enough love, indifference towards other Jews, coldness. Meaning, I can think about why was the second Beis HaMikdash destroyed and then resolve to improve myself vis-a-vis that particular avera. But Asara B'Teves is not about Sinat Chinam. Asara B'Teves is about the first temple. Now, the first temple, the sins which would be on my mind would be Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayos, Shvichas Damim. So here's the question. How do I relate to that? Am I that bad? All right, Sinas Chinam, which includes Lashon Hara, that I have. But Avodah Zarah? I don't worship idols. Gilui Arayos? Most of us at least are not nichshal in actual sexual sin and murder. Meaning the question, this is the conceptual problem that I have here. Meaning to say, given the fact that Asara B'Tevet is miyuchad only with respect to the Mikdash Rishon, the first temple, and not the Mikdash Sheni, and not the second temple, and given the fact that the Averos of the first Beis HaMikdash are Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayos, Shvichas Damim, how am I supposed to do tshuva for those sins if they are not the sins which are really infecting my personality? Unlike Sinat Chinam, which unfortunately all of us are tainted with in one way or the other. So let me share with you the thought of Rav Tzadok of Lublin, a beautiful thought. And, well, first of all, let me make a preliminary thought. First of all, even if we're not guilty of these averos literally, let's remember that Chazal equated many other things as equivalent. For example, Chazal say, Kol HaKoes, anyone that is angry, is tantamount to idol worship. So I'm not guilty of Avodah Zarah, but do I have anger? That's Avodah Zarah. Or Chazal say, anyone that, if you humiliate somebody publicly, Hamal ben Pnei Chaveru Barabim, is treated as murder. So maybe I didn't stick a knife into somebody's heart, but if I humiliated him publicly, I'm a murderer. Gilui Arayos? Well, President Carter, I saw a picture of him recently at George H.W. Bush's funeral, once famously remarked that he has committed adultery in his heart many times. Now, the press made fun of it and the like, but that is a worthy statement, actually. That is a serious statement, that sexual temptation can be transgressed in many, many different ways, and it doesn't have to be an actual physical act. And certainly in the culture that we live in, which is suffused with unbridled sexuality of very, very improper types, it's very easy for a person to be nichshal, at least in his mind and heart, with Gilui Arayos. So on one level, therefore, Avodah Zarah can exist in the form of anger, Shvichas Damim can exist in the form of embarrassing people, and Gilui Arayos can exist in the form of exposure to the hedonistic culture that we're surrounded with.
Question, but don't we admire, doesn't it increase our admiration for if a Jew was tempted but resisted his temptation?
Well, that's a fascinating question, and once again, I think the Makoros, the sources, are quite ambivalent. On one hand, we profess great admiration for the person who conquers.
Yosef?
Right, powerful urges. That is a great thing. On the other hand, there's a certain condemnation for having those urges, that a truly righteous person would have transcended them. So it kind of goes both ways a little bit. Now, but let me share with you Rav Tzadok. Rav Tzadok takes it a little bit in a different direction, although it's connected. He says that the three cardinal averos of Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayos, Shvichas Damim are really symptoms of deeper flaws of character. And therefore, even if you're asymptomatic, even if your behavior has not carried out to those extremities, the underlying root causes are still there. Now, what are the underlying root causes? So we know in Pirkei Avos tells us, Al Shlosha Devarim Ha'olam Omed. The world stands on three pillars of holiness. Torah, learning of Torah, Avodah, divine service, Gemilas Chasadim, acts of loving kindness. We know that these are the three Avos. Avram is the pillar of loving kindness, of Chesed. Yitzchak is the pillar of divine service. He was a Korban. Yaakov, who spent 14 years in the yeshiva of Shem and Eber, represents Torah. So these are the three pillars of holiness without which God is not in the world, and God is not in your life. But the same way there are three pillars that bring sanctity and holiness into the world, there are three factors that destroy holiness. And this is Rabbi Elazar HaKapor's statement, also in Pirkei Avos. Hakina, kina is jealousy. Tava is unrestrained lust for sensual pleasure. And kavod, a desire, an arrogant desire for ego gratification, self-aggrandizement, glory-seeking. These three factors, hakina, v'hatava, v'hakavod, motzien esa adam min ha'olam. They take a person out of this world. They destroy this spiritual world. So says Rav Tzadok, kina, which is really a denial. What is envy? I begrudge that person whatever blessing he has. I don't want him to have it. It should belong to me. Kina is essentially taking away the legitimacy of that person's existence. And in an extreme way, it could actually lead to murder. And in fact, if you look at the typical violent murder, factoring out terrorism, which unfortunately we are all too familiar with here, but if you simply look at street crime, you will commonly find that quite a lot of homicides, in fact some say the majority, depending on the community, are really crimes coming from petty jealousy among family members. I wanted your sneakers, I want your coat. You were looking at my wife the wrong way. Right? So indeed, jealousy in an extreme way can lead to murder. Conceptually and philosophically, it's connected to the idea that when you deny the legitimacy of a person, the totality of a person's existence, you may eventually deny his legitimacy to life itself. That's kina, shvichas damim. Taiva and Gilui Arayos is pretty self-evident. A lust for hedonistic pleasure could lead to Gilui Arayos. Now the third one is the most subtle. Kavod. Kavod is ego gratification, arrogance. How is that connected to idolatry? So here Rav Tzadok says, in a more conceptual, symbolic way, Avodah Zarah literally means foreign worship, strange worship. It doesn't have to mean you're bowing down to a statue. But any type of ideal or ideology or idea or concept that becomes central to your life over and above Avodat Hashem becomes Avodah Zarah. So the person that is suffused with kavod has made his own ego his own God. That every decision he makes is motivated by what will feed into his narcissism, what will feed into his glory. And you could even be a very religious Jew, you could be a very observant Jew, but kavod could be the dominating thought and aspect of your life. And that is a form of Avodah Zarah. So what is Rav Tzadok saying? That yes, on Asara B'Teves, we think about the Averot of Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayos, Shvichas Damim, because Asara B'Teves is a Mikdash Rishon fast, not a Mikdash Sheni fast. And yet, it doesn't mean Avodah Zarah in the literal sense of bowing down to an idol, but Avodah Zarah has a manifestation in my worshiping my ego, and Gilui Arayos is connected to Taiva, and Shvichas Damim is connected to Kinah. Now, in my yeshiva or Sameach, we're presently doing a building campaign. Some of you know that. So if you go by the yeshiva, you'll see a huge, huge hole in the ground. Very, very deep foundation that has been dug. Now, the very first thing you have to do when you build a new building is clean the site, remove the garbage and the debris off the site. You can't build without removing the garbage from the area. And that's exactly the way the Beis HaMikdash works as well. You can't build a Beis HaMikdash until you get rid of the garbage. The garbage is all of the static that is preventing us from connecting to the Almighty. The sinas chinam, the kinah, the jealousy, the taiva, the kavod. All of that is garbage. And therefore, what is our job on these fast days? To clear out our systems, to try to work on getting rid of the midos ros that prevent our hearts and our souls from becoming a mishkan, a true dwelling place of God. Remember, when Hashem gave the commandment to build the tabernacle, which was the first Beis HaMikdash, Asu li mikdash, make for me a temple, v'shachanti b'tocham, so I will dwell not in the temple, I will dwell in their hearts. The temple of Hashem has to be in our heart, in our soul. And when we have the garbage in there, the temple can't be there. And until the temple is in here, it's not going to be out there. Right? The temple that's going to be on Har HaMoriah, B'Yezrat Hashem B'Karov, cannot come down min hashamayim until our hearts and our souls are ready for God to dwell there. And that's why these midos ros are so significant. Now, let me mention one final interesting point. Generally speaking, the fast days connected to the temple are rooted in earlier Averos in our historical experience. So, for example, the 9th of Av was rooted in the sin of the spies, because the spies came back on the 8th of Av and they gave their report, and that night all of the nation cried bitterly and complained and didn't have faith, and Hashem said, you have cried for naught this night, for no reason. I will make this day eternal crying. So Tisha B'Av is connected to the Chet HaMeraglim. The 17th of Tammuz, which is the day of the Second Temple, when the Romans broke through the wall, is connected to the day that Moshe Rabbeinu came down with the tablets after 40 days, and he saw the golden calf, and he smashed the luchos. So Tisha B'Av is connected to the Meraglim. 17th of Tammuz is connected to the Chet HaEgel. Those were the two major sins our forefathers committed in the desert. There were other Averis, but the major ones are the Chet HaEgel Chet HaMeraglim. So the question is Asara B'Teves connected to anything? Like, is there any antecedent Avera that Asara B'Teves is connected? So in Chazal, we actually don't find something. But in later Svarim, and they seem to have no source. I don't know how they know this. Are they just guessing? But in later Svarim, it is asserted that Asara B'Teves was the date that Yosef was sold into slavery by his brothers. So as a result, we now have Asara B'Teves Mechiras Yosef, Shiva Asar B'Tamuz Chet HaEgel, Tisha B'Av Chet HaMeraglim. Now, what's fascinating about this, although I wish there would be some definitive source, what's fascinating about this is that this, in effect, brings the second temple into the 10th of Teves as well. Because although the historical event of the 10th of Teves only connects to the Mikdash Rishon, and the Mikdash Rishon were the sins of Avodah Zarah, Gilei Arayah, Shvichas Damim. But if Asara B'Teves was the day of Mechiras Yosef, what sin is involved in Mechiras Yosef? Obviously, hatred, jealousy, sinas chinam. So in a sense, it's already rooted in Asara B'Teves, not only the Chorban of the first Mikdash, but also the Chorban of the second Mikdash. There is a teaching of the Chassam Sofer, maybe I should have said this last week in preparation for the fast, that Asara B'Teves is the Yom Hadin, is a day of judgment, where God decides, will the temple be rebuilt this year or not? Meaning Asara B'Teves is when Hashem paskins, will there be a binyan Beis HaMikdash this year, or will it have to wait? So all we can say is already after that fact, we can just hope and pray that our fast and our prayers and our tshuva and our attempt to work at our midos tovos to make them better should give Klal Yisrael a favorable din min hashamayim, that we should be zocha to the binyan Beis HaMikdash b'mheira v'yameinu. But again, in order to have that Beis HaMikdash, there has to be v'shachanti b'tocham, when Hashem is living in our heart and in our soul. Then and only then do we merit the Mikdash, which will come down min hashamayim. So, all be well and take care.
Amen.